Gentlemen, we have just witnessed the debut of Kamala Gentlemen, we have just witnessed the debut of Kamala Harris in her first presidential debate against President Donald Trump, the former president. And we have already seen the discussion circling around the internet, and we aim to provide you with some of the perspectives on the angles from China. So with that in mind, we'd like to invite Victor Gao, the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, known as CCG, and the fierce commentators. Mr. Gao, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So first of all, I would like to ask, it's Kamala Harris' first debate as a presidential candidate. How do you think of her performance?
First of all, I watched the presidential debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and I read a lot of commentary and some of the polls being done after the end of the debate. As far as Kamala Harris is concerned, I personally think she did a very good job, very solid, and she laid out what she believed to be her goals if she is elected the president of the United States. However, on the other hand, I personally do not agree with some of the polls, especially the poll done by CNN, which put Kamala Harris absolutely as the winner of the debate. I think, just like the presidential polls in recent days, it is too close to call. And while Kamala Harris did a good job in her first presidential debate against Donald Trump actually did quite well in his own way. After all, this is his sixth presidential debate, and he has the largest amount of presidential debates compared with anyone else in US history. And never underestimate Donald Trump, because eventually it's not this debate that will count. Eventually it is the electoral votes that you can muster that will eventually count as to who will win the presidential election on November the 5th.
So as we know that today's debate has a new mechanism, it's about the strict time limit. And there are also some improvements on the debating mechanism, such as muting the opponent while the other one is speaking. So based on today's performance, who do you think is more taking advantage of this kind of debating mechanism?
Well, I would say the debating methodology was agreed upon between Donald Trump and President Joe Biden before he decided to bail out of the presidential campaign. Therefore, both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris basically took over what was originally agreed to between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Now, for these important elements, for example, muting the speaker if you are not the speaker, in order to avoid interrupting of the speaker, for example, I think this is actually very important. As a matter of fact, I understand Kamala Harris's team before today's debate even tried to discontinue with this arrangement because they thought that if Donald Trump can speak as he wants and try to interject into Kamala Harris's answering of the questions, it may actually prove to be more of a harm to Donald Trump. However, I think ABC did the right thing of keeping to the original arranged methodology, and both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris had to abide by this methodology. And I would say both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump did quite well in following this agreed methodology. And I don't think Donald Trump attempted to interrupt Kamala Harris as much as, for example, Kamala Harris's team would want, and Kamala Harris herself also very well abided by this methodology. So eventually, I think both did quite well under this arrangement. After all, this debate took place not in front of a live audience. It's basically just in front of the two moderators. And I think this overall change in the atmosphere, etc., combined with this muting of the mic, made sure that the debate itself was more in line with the pre-arrangement originally between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and later between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Both did quite well under this discipline.
So you think that will bring more precise information to the audiences, even though they are not there, they're just watching on the television, right?
No, I think this muting the mic has one advantage. That is, whoever is the speaker, either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, could complete whatever he or she has to say and make a full answer to a question, rather than being interrupted by the other side, because such constant and unexpected interruptions may change the course of discussion according to the original plan and distract the speaker from the original course of action or course of discussion that he or she wanted to follow. And this would make the whole debate more coherent, more disciplined, and the messages conveyed by either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris more comprehensible, rather than making it more haphazard, for example, and disorderly. So I personally believe this is a very good arrangement, especially when Donald Trump and Joe Biden originally agreed to use this methodology.
Okay, so we've just shown the footage of the debating, and as we can clearly see that even though it's kind of a difficult issue to discuss in depth, but the reality is that it would be difficult for people watching the debate not to categorize it as one debate between a woman of color and from South Asian and a white man. And that it might be a major factor in the US. And do you think this kind of factor will affect the debate or the election?
I hope not. While Donald Trump has been described as very much of a white supremacist, for example, or a populist, I don't think he wanted to project himself as anti-minorities or anti-female candidate or anti-ethnic background with Jamaican ethnicity or South Asian ethnicity, because I'm pretty sure Donald Trump knows if he wanted to do that, that's an invitation for disaster. Because right now, especially in the coming 8 weeks, every vote counts. And both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris wants to invite any vote they can line up to support himself or herself, rather than taking any risk of alienating one portion of the population or one ethnic group. And in that sense, Kamala Harris actually has some advantages, because after all, she's a woman. She came from Jamaican ethnicity as well as Indian ethnicity. So she has some benefits in different categories, whereas Donald Trump is generally believed as a kind of white supremacist, even though he does not agree to that. And whatever he does seems to either show disdain to the ethnic minorities in the United States, or didn't project enough caring and understanding of the real situations involving ethnic minorities, including Afro-Americans or Asian minorities or Caribbean minorities. So that's the contrast between Donald Trump as a candidate versus Kamala Harris as a candidate. And I don't think Donald Trump tried his best to twist his own perception in this dynamics. He didn't want to lose any potential vote if he is perceived as being hostile against either Afro-Americans or Asian Americans.
Yes. And you mentioned about votes, and as we know that the debate just happened earlier this morning in Beijing time, so we still don't know how much this impact this debate will have on the polls. But before that, we did some research. Trump and Harris were evenly matched in approval ratings in major national polls in the United States. So do you think this debate will have a greater impact on the polls for both parties, thereby further affecting the election?
Well, I'm pretty sure this presidential debate will have some impact on the presidential election over the coming 8 weeks or so. However, we need to also understand that the structure of the presidential election is such that each state casts its vote separately. Therefore, you are talking about 50 states casting their separate votes. And secondly, it's not just the general votes that eventually will count. It's more importantly the electoral votes, that is 270 or more electoral votes. Therefore, for example, if we look at big states like California or New York, traditionally they would vote Democratic, regardless of this presidential debate, for example. However, eventually it boils down to about 6 swing states. These are borderline states. They can vote either Republican or Democrats, for example. And I think both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are very much focused on winning as many votes as possible in these swing states, because these swing states and ultimately the electoral votes that they will generate will eventually decide the final outcome of this presidential election. It is not the big states like California or New York, which are more or less settled, or, for example, Middle Eastern states, which traditionally vote Republican. They are counted already. It is the swing states, more or less about 6 of them, that will eventually decide the electoral votes for one or the other.
So you mentioned about the swing states, and that kind of brings us back to the history about the last 2 US elections that has been full of dramas. In 2016, because of the swing states and the electoral votes that you mentioned before, Trump unexpectedly defeated Hillary Clinton. And in 2020, Biden narrowly won, and then went off the riots in the Capitol Hill before Biden took the place. And do you think that this time the US elections will become more and more dramatic? And if so, what will be the reason behind this kind of phenomenon? Will we see a more divided US?
First of all, I think the 2024 presidential election in the United States has already proven to be very dramatic, or even more dramatic than the 2016 or 2020 presidential election. Why? Because you are talking about an attempted assassination on the life of Donald Trump, and he barely escaped the assassination. And if he did not twist his head in a very dramatic way, his head probably would have been blown off. This was not an ordinary assassin. This assassin had a mission, that is to blow off the head of Donald Trump, to make sure that he will no longer be a politician, he will no longer have any chance to continue with his presidential election. Now, the other fact that the door of Donald Trump's private jet had some malfunctions in a few days after the attempted assassination on the life of Donald Trump was also very mysterious. It seems that there was a pattern of some kind of attempt to take out Donald Trump. Now, if you do not call this extraordinary and very untraditional, I think we are not talking about the realities in this presidential election. Now, 8 weeks later, what will be the result? If Donald Trump wins, the United States may be thrown into great chaos, because Donald Trump has threatened to go after those political forces which he probably said sabotaged his previous presidential election or tried to deny him of success in this year's presidential election. If Kamala Harris wins, Donald Trump may again resist the result of this presidential election, and the whole country may be again thrown into instability, chaos, and even anarchy. We do not know. Let's keep our eyes wide open to see what exactly will happen in the coming 8 weeks and immediately after the announcement of the results of the presidential election will be made.
So, but you do believe that this debate will cause a new round of divisions in the United States?
Not necessarily this debate itself. I think the internecine struggle and the rivalry between Donald Trump on the one hand and Kamala Harris on the other hand, in a sense, Donald Trump cannot afford to lose, because if he loses this presidential election, he's destined to go and serve in a prison, and his family wealth may be significantly eroded, and he may spend many years under the bar in a prison, for example. And if Kamala Harris wins the election, Donald Trump may refuse to accept the result of the presidential election and may come up with all excuses to fight against the legitimacy of this presidential election, thus throwing the United States into a very dangerous period of instability and chaos. So we do not know what will happen. The key is the coming 8 weeks, and we will be prepared. We need to be prepared for all kinds of possibilities because of the ultimate result of this presidential election in the United States. It's no longer a matter for the American people themselves. It is a matter of global bearing on peace and development in the world.
Yeah, you mentioned about the globe, and that's why I want to bring the topic to China. So during the debate, as we noticed that the economic problem of the United States were the first topic to be debated. And the US economy, as we know, has experienced serious inflation in the past few years, and discussion around the world about whether the Federal Reserve is about to cut interest rate are very intense around the globe. And as an important part of the global economy, how should China deal with the possible impact of US domestic economic adjustment?
First of all, China does not have any role to play in this presidential election in the United States, meaning China is at best an observer, and China just needs to wait until the result of the presidential election is disclosed immediately after the ending of the election on November the 5th. And China needs to be prepared to deal with either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, whichever wins the election, as he or she is, and hopefully the United States and China can get along with each other in peace rather than fall apart and get to each other's jugular, for example. Therefore, China's role is very much limited, and we need to have patience, and we need to have all the curiosity to watch exactly what's happening over the course of the coming 8 weeks. Now, generally speaking, I think Donald Trump or Kamala Harris will need to have enough courage to say that the tariffs that Donald Trump started to levy against Chinese export to the United States starting in 2017, for example, and continued by Joe Biden in his more than 3 years of US president, are the wrong thing, because these huge tariffs contributed to the runaway inflation in the United States, which actually eroded the living standards of the American people, especially the working level of the American people. Now, Kamala Harris called the Trump-initiated tariffs against Chinese exports to the United States as Trump tax. She may be right to a certain extent, but she forgot to emphasize that Joe Biden continued with these tariffs against Chinese export. So she should at least say that these tariffs are both Trump taxes against the American people as well as Biden taxes against the American people. She further forgot to mention that if she is elected the president of the United States, whether she will scrap or discontinue with all these tariffs, either initiated by former President Donald Trump or by Joe Biden. Therefore, I don't think either Donald Trump or President Joe Biden or Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris have demonstrated enough wisdom and courage and resourcefulness in calling the tariffs as what they are, that is a tax against the US American people, rather than, for example, the tariffs being paid by China or the Chinese government. No, if you levy more and more tariffs against Chinese exports to the United States, you distort the economic situation in the United States. You lead to higher inflation and causing the worsening off of the economic situation involving the American people. It is high time to stop all these nonsensical tariffs against Chinese export to the United States.
Yes. And you also mentioned about the tariffs, and we have noticed that before the debate, Trump actually said he wants to impose a 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. And during the debate, while they were talking about the environmental issue section, he said that, Chinese manufacturing industry is building vehicles and all the high-end products in Mexico and export to United States. And he threatened to continue to increase the tariffs on those products. So I just want to know that if Trump is really elected, will that create another new kind of wave to the high-end industries in China? And how should China react to this kind of problem?
Well, if I have a chance to talk to Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, I want to emphasize one thing. First of all, the automobile industry in the United States for more than 100 years has always been a pillar industry in the United States. Therefore, how to maintain the sustainability of the automobile industry in the United States itself is a very important thing. No one should underestimate that. Secondly, there is a revolution of EV to replace fuel cars. And the real competition in the EV revolution is not between China versus the United States. It is between EV, which is a technology of the future, versus fuel car, which is a technology of yesterday. In addition to the fact that fuel cars does generate a lot of carbon emission. Therefore, in order to make sure that the US automobile industry is really sustainable, the American people and the American companies need to make that leap of faith from fuel cars to embracing the EVs. Therefore, China should not be viewed as a competitor or as an enemy. China should be viewed as a resource that the American automobile industry can utilize to make that leap of faith. Mm-hmm. Because if the American industry refuses to make that leap of faith and embrace EV as a new ecosystem, what will happen most likely is a repetition of Kodak. Kodak used to be a great company, but it did not innovate in a timely manner and eventually went into bankruptcy. I'm afraid that if the American automobile industry does not pick up its acts together and scramble into action and make that leap of faith and start to embrace EV revolution as quickly as possible, the fuel car industry in the United States will eventually, sooner or later, become another Kodak. That's not the right way to make sure that the automobile industry in the United States is sustainable. And that's not the right way to promote economic development in the United States. And I hope both Donald Trump or Kamala Harris will really have enough depth in their mind and wisdom and courage to see that the automobile industry today is at a major crossing point. You need to embrace the EV revolution rather than fight against this megatrend of the EV revolution.
Okay. So speaking of the U.S. policies to China, our crew and we have watched the whole debate, and we noticed that China, that word used to be frequently appeared from Donald Trump during his debate with Biden, only appears like 3 to 4 times during the debate this morning. So what does it reflect? Does it indicate that the domestic problems is now becoming the major issues in the United States, that the politicians want to pay more attention to it or not? Should China be more vigilant to this kind of situation?
First of all, I personally don't think it's surprising at all. I spent about 10 days in New York and Washington and Annapolis, in Maryland, etc. And I talked to a lot of people in the United States, personal friends, business people, academics, for example. And I think what they really care about is how to improve the living standards of the American people and how to get their acts together, for example. And they do not want to see China become an enemy of the United States. There is no fun of turning China into an enemy of the United States. And from the Chinese perspective, China does not view itself as an enemy of the United States. We should get along with each other. Therefore, it is not surprising at all that the presidential debate or the presidential election campaigns itself do not focus on China-US relations. Because if they keep talking about China, they really divert from very important economic issues facing the American people as a whole to non-consequential things. I don't think those politicians in the United States who want to turn China into an enemy of the United States are doing real favor for the fundamental interest of the American people. Therefore, it's not surprising. Secondly, if Donald Trump becomes the president or Kamala Harris becomes the US president, I'm afraid China-US relations may continue to deteriorate for the coming 4 years. But for the medium and longer term, I'm an optimist for China-US relations because I firmly believe in the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. Why? Because I really doubt about any legitimacy of the destined for war scenario being applied to China-US relations, because that distinguished the professor at Harvard who did a lot of scholarly work, published a book called Destined for War, and attempts have been made to apply this destined for war or to Sidney's trap theory to China-US relations. They forget, or they forgot to mention to mankind, that all the cases of war analyzed in that book, Destined for War, were conventional wars, whereas both China and the United States are two very important nuclear powers. You cannot apply conclusions you derived at by analyzing conventional wars to two large important nuclear powers. Therefore, I think while there are many differences between China and the United States, I'm pretty sure eventually China and the United States will need to get along with each other. And whatever problems there are, serious as they may be, need to be resolved by peaceful means. That's the reason why I'm firmly believing in my theory of inevitability of peace between China and the United States. I think for the medium and longer term, China and the United States need to get along with each other rather than, for example, having some politicians agitating for hostility, confrontation, or even war between our two great countries of the United States of America and China.
So, Mr. Gao, you mentioned about peace, and my next question, which is the second last question, is about the regional conflict. So, in the debates, both Harris and Trump called for an end to the Palestinian and the Israeli conflict and the Ukraine crisis. So, in the debate, Harris, we can see that she was more inclined to fully support Israel, NATO, and Ukraine. and pursue her alliance policy. And Trump made it clear that if he was elected, he would quickly end the Russian-Ukraine war and continue his American first foreign policy. So my question is, who is more likely to have a key impact on this regional conflict? And how should China react to it?
First of all, it depends on who wins the presidential election eventually. If Donald Trump wins, he may actually do what he promised to do. That is to end the Russian-Ukrainian war within 24 hours. How he will achieve that, he knows better than anyone else. I think if the United States discontinues the support for more weapons and funding for Ukraine, this whole war will fizzle out. And China from day one has been advocating for immediate ceasefire to this Russian-Ukrainian war and using diplomacy and negotiations to solve whatever problems there are between Russia and Ukraine. Whereas President Joe Biden has been promoting the continuation of the war rather than entering into any serious negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. So Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris may be very, very different about this Ukrainian war. I personally believe to end the war as quickly as possible is in the best interest of Russia and Ukraine and European countries and the world at large. Any continuation of this war will not be in the fundamental interest of the Ukrainian people. Ukrainian lives should be considered as valuable as lives of any people in any European country. So don't urge the Ukrainians to fight until the last living Ukrainian. Ukrainian lives need to be saved because they are very precious. They are as precious as you can expect for any life in any country. Now, you talked about Israeli-Palestinian war, which is hugely a human tragedy. I think Kamala Harris is a little bit confused as to what to say and what to do because she wants to have both sides of the same coin. She wants to make sure that all the Israeli people, for example, and the Jewish interests would vote for her. And she also does not want to cause a lot of revolt against the atrocities committed by the Israeli armed forces inside Gaza. After all, more than 40,000 innocent people have been killed. More than 75% of them are women and children, including many pregnant women. So I think the world is in outrage against such atrocities committed against the Palestinian people. And something needs to be done to end the war immediately and prevent any more innocent life from being killed. Therefore, I think Kamala Harris is walking on very tight rope. She wants to have both sides of the equation and maximize the vote she can gather for her campaign. Now, I can understand why she is a little bit cautious on this point rather than going all the way to the hilt in, for example, promoting the two-state solution and protecting the legitimate interests of the Palestinian people as much as protecting the legitimate rights of the Israeli people. So I hope when this presidential election is over, either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris will do the right thing to make sure that the Palestinian people's legitimate rights need to be protected. And the only way to do that is to achieve the two-state solution. I don't think mankind or the world should sit idle to see the continuation of the atrocities against innocent Palestinian people any day in the future.
So, Mr. Gao, and this brings us to our last question. And you mentioned about the tragedies, the wars that's going on around the globe. And as we know that you are a person with seasoned resume and many years of experience in think tanks and international relations. So today's debate clearly shows that we're embracing a more divided, confrontational, and tense international situations. And so what should China do in the future to develop more peacefully and stably under the current international situation?
I think China will continue to be a major force for maintaining stability at home and keeping peace in the world. China never uses war as a top priority or a preferred methodology. China always wants to exhaust everything else before war is even considered. And China will not fire the first shot at any other country. And China will work its maximum way, try to achieve peaceful solutions for whatever problems there may be between China and any of the other countries in the world. Therefore, China is a major force for peace and stability and development, and China's goal to promote the establishment of the common community of shared future for mankind is the right step in the world of multipolarity, where peace may face threats from different quarters and war may raise its dangerous head against the common prosperity of mankind as a whole. Therefore, I do hope China will stand firm on matters of principle and be a major voice for peace and a major voice against the war, and always emphasize the absolute necessity and the importance of diplomacy and negotiations, and refuse to let any weight to war, cold war or hot war of any kind, because war is the last thing mankind would need, and peace is always in short supply.
That is a peaceful and brilliant answer to conclude our interview today with Mr. Gao again, the Vice President of the CCG. Thank you, Mr. Gao. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
And this is Joe from Ibis. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.